Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Joe. I'm an associate minister here at Real Life, and if you've tuned in online, welcome. We're glad to have you here. Before we begin, is everyone set up for Christmas at home? Is anyone not set up for Christmas? There you go. Couple. All right. You're all right. In our house, we do it pretty early. We're like a right after Thanksgiving family. We set everything up, and we make a big day out of it. It's a lot of fun. It's probably my favorite time of this season because my kids are older. I have a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old, and so they're kind of at that stage of just, other things are more fun than hanging out at home. And so this is a day where we all get together and we, clean the house and we get all the decoration set up and pull everything out. And while we were decorating this year, my son made an interesting statement. We were setting up the nativity scene, which we have. We have little figurines that we set up, and it goes in front of our TV. And my son is setting up the nativity scene, and he said, and he kind of goes, ugh. And Jane, my wife, goes, what? And he goes, this is not canonically correct. Now, two things I want to observe about that statement that I'm very impressed with my son. One, that he knows the word canonically. And two, he recognizes that there are variations to this nativity scene that aren't actually historically correct. And, things like the wise men being at the stable at the infancy of Jesus' birth. And last week, which kind of leads us to what we're talking about today here, this sermon series on King, because we were exploring the Magi, the wise men, and the gifts that they brought. And Justin did a great job last week of talking about the characters at the story, and in Matthew chapter 2 specifically, we learn about these characters that come to visit Jesus. Now, Matthew's the only gospel writer that tells us about this situation. None of the other gospels tell us about this. And so we have this interesting story about wise men who come. We assume three because there are three gifts listed there, but we don't know how many there were there. Maybe one, and they all had, at least two, because it was plural. So we don't know. That's not the point. But our nativity scenes have them there with their gifts, a little baby Jesus there. And but Matthew actually tells us he was a boy, and they went to the house. So they were no longer wherever they were that Mary gave birth, and they had moved on to a home, and this is where they found Jesus. And so Justin did this last week, and he talked about the gift of gold. And how the gift of gold is a gift for a king. And he challenged us to explore in ourselves what are the gifts that we can bring to Jesus this year. And I want to challenge you to continue to wrestle with that, because that's not just a simple thing that is a one-time thought process that you have with Jesus. Every season of life, there's maybe a different gift that you can offer based off the season of life that you're in. And we should always be wrestling with that. I hope that you continue to do so. And this week, though, we're going to explore a little bit deeper about another gift that was brought to Jesus. And for our purposes, to understand what's happening here, we've got to go way back, and we've got to understand some things that are happening in the background. And so we're going to do a little digging in the text, and we're going to talk about something that maybe you're familiar with. Sometimes I make assumptions that people, that have grown up in church might know certain things, but one thing I'm learning is that a lot of times people come and they don't know certain things. And so we're going to explore. So for some of you that might be in the room and you go, yeah, I know all this, yeah, maybe, sit back and relax. But for those that don't, you might lean in a little bit more this morning, because we got to ask these questions, right? So one of the questions I ask when I read the text is one, why does Matthew tell us this story? Why is it not important enough for Mark, Luke, and John to tell us? Why would they leave it out or not bother to even give us this information? So what's important about for Matthew to tell us this story? Why does Matthew tell us the details of the gifts? Right, that's a good question that we could be asked. Like, why tell us this? He could have just said, hey, some people came and they gave him gifts to honor him. But no, he gives us specifics. 3 gifts. Why these 3 gifts? These are important questions. When we read the text and we just kind of blur over it when we read the story, but when we stop and we begin to be curious about the text and ask these questions, some interesting things begin to pop up. So, the idea here is that Jesus is a king. But in the scriptures, Jesus isn't simply known as a king. He's known as the priest king, or the king priest. You see, there was a prophecy long ago that was talked about how one day a new priestly king would come and rule over Israel. And we learn about this prophecy in Psalm 110. This is from David. David writes this psalm, and this is what it says. And it's important for our discussion here about Jesus being our priest king. This is what it says in Psalms 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit in the place of honor at my right hand until I humble your enemies, making them a footstool under your feet. The Lord will extend your powerful kingdom from Jerusalem. You will rule over your enemies. When you go to war, your people will serve you willingly. You are arrayed in holy garments, and your strength will be renewed each day like the morning dew. The Lord has taken an oath and will not break his vow. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now, some interesting statements that we learn when we stop to look at this text a little bit more in Psalm 10. First observation is the opening line. The Lord said to my Lord. Now, what's happening here is that David is talking about two characters involved, and one Lord is saying to another Lord, which is not referring to himself as Lord. He's saying, the Lord, the chief, the Yahweh Lord, said to my Lord, which means for King David, there is someone above him that he's recognizing. And God says about David's Lord some interesting things. He says he's going to rule over a kingdom, so he's going to be like a king, but also at the end, he is also going to be a priest. And so this serves as a prophecy here about the role that Jesus plays in the lives of all of us, that he is a kingly priest. This is where we get the idea. In Deuteronomy, Moses tells the people that they will be a royal priesthood. And Peter picks up on this in his writings where he talks about the people of God being a royal priesthood. Royal being kingdom people, priesthood functioning as priests, okay? So Jesus, throughout the scriptures, the writers are trying to tell us that Jesus serves both of these purposes. He is the fulfillment, or at least he is the Lord that David's talking about when he says, the Lord said to my Lord, insert Jesus. The Lord, God said to Jesus, you are going to be this. And so out of that prophecy, the people began to look for one who would come and fulfill both being a king and also being a priest. They were to be both. And so this was the hope, this was the anticipation of what was called the Messiah, or in the Greek, the Christ. The Christ would come. And this is the title that Jesus wore. So, if Jesus serves not only as a king, but as a priest, every priest serves in a temple, or at least for the ancient Israelites, a tabernacle. All right? So this is where we're going to dive in a little bit. On the back of your notes, you have this diagram that is up on the screen right now. Back of your notes has this diagram. This is going to be a little fill in the blanks, all right? So we're going to break out our pens. We're going to work together here. It might feel like school, and I apologize, but we're going to fill in the blanks and learn a little bit about this thing called the tabernacle. The tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle, for the ancient Israelites that are coming out of Egypt, they meet God at a mountain called Sinai, and on the mountaintop, God shows up and communicates to Moses what he wants his people to begin to do. And one of the first things that God begins to explain after he gives some commandments is how to construct a mobile home for God, okay? Called the tabernacle. It's like a moving mobile home. It was where God would come. It's a place where God would come, show up, and communicate to his people through Moses, through the priest, and this was a mobile tent or a mobile home where God would move with them wherever they went. In the desert, they would tear down the tent, they would set up the tent, and it was called a tabernacle. And this tabernacle is explained in the middle of Exodus. You get all this details about how to make this tabernacle. And what we learn is that there's some elements that are relevant to us today. And you might be going, Joe, where are you going? Trust me, we will get there. Stay with me. It's important. We got to learn these things, okay? So the tabernacle served a specific purpose, but this is how it was constructed. So there was an outer perimeter that was like a rectangle outer perimeter. And this outer perimeter had posts that had cloth that would make a walled structure. And then there was an opening at the end where people could come in and out. This perimeter, this area was called the outer courts. The outer courts was the circumference of this area. And then the Israelites were commanded that they were to set up their tents all the way around this outer courts area. And so the tabernacle served as the central focal point of their existence, because they would encamp all the way around it, and then God would show up and they would communicate. This outer court area had three things that filled this area. One was the altar. That they would make sacrifices on, different kinds of sacrifices that were required that they would learn about. And it had a wash basin. And this wash basin was for them to purify themselves, cleanse themselves. And then there was another structure inside. And this other structure was like another rectangle, just a smaller one that sat inside the outer courts. And this is called the most holy place, or the holy place. Okay, this holy place, specifically, that you got in here, had some items in it as well. So when we zoom into the holy place, this is what we begin to find. There were two curtains inside the holy place. There was a curtain on the front end so that it would kind of block off access from people just walking in. Then there was a curtain about 3/4 of the way, 3/4 of the way in. There was another curtain. That's a specific curtain called the veil. Okay? And that veil, we'll get back to that in a second. That served a very important purpose. But so you had these two sectioned off. In the front end of the holy place, you had three items that were in it. It was the table of showbread. And this was a table that bread would be put on it that would remind the Israelites of God's daily provision for them. So they would place bread in there. There's an interesting story about David, King David going in. He was famished and he needed to eat. And they take the bread from the table of showbread and feed him. And this was like a big no-no. But anyway, this is the table of showbread. So that was in there. You had the menorah, or the candlestick, which was used to give light to the priests that would go in there and perform their duties. And then there was the altar of incense. The altar of incense. And so these are the three items that were inside that front section of the holy place. Then there was the veil that kind of blocked off the back quarter of this structure. And this was called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. Anybody ever heard that term before, Holy of Holies? Okay, so that was what this area was called. And this area housed one specific item. The Ark of the Covenant was inside of this. And so this is the main kind of structure. And then when we zoom back out, this is basically what it looks like. This would be the tabernacle and how it was set up. And then the Israelites would camp around it. And so that should be all your fill in the blanks in the back if you weren't able to catch it there. Now, for our purposes, there's a lot that could be said about all the different things about this tabernacle. But for our purposes, I want to zoom in on one specific item. That's the altar of incense. The altar of incense. This is a very specific item that's outlined in Exodus chapter 30. And in Exodus chapter 30, it begins to tell us a little bit about this altar. It tells us that it's not a big thing. It's about 18 by 18 inches, and then about 36 inches tall. It has 4 horns that sit on the corner of this little altar. It has some rings on the side, 2 rings on each side that they could put poles down because this thing had to be mobile, right? This is a mobile home, so they had to tear it down and set it up every time they go to a new place. So they had to be able to transport this thing. And so this is this little thing that sat in front of the veil. Okay, the veil that blocked access to the Ark of the Covenant. It sat right in front of the veil. Now, this altar of incense served 2 purposes, primarily 2 purposes. One, every day, the priests were commanded to go in and burn incense on top of this altar. And this altar was... Real quick, Exodus chapter 30, verse 10. It's important to understand. This altar is said to be the most holy, the Lord's most holy altar. Now, no other item in the tabernacle gets this kind of description. So it sets itself apart as something that's most holy to the Lord. Okay? So this is a very significant item that sits in front of the veil before you go into the Ark of the Covenant. And so every day, incense would need to be burnt on it. So there was the ritual. Every single day they would go in, they would burn incense. There's a story in Luke's gospel, I believe. Zechariah goes in to perform the duties as a priest. He goes into, what he's doing is he's lighting the incense because that was the daily command. And that's where God shows up to him, tells him that Elizabeth is going to bear a child. And he goes mute from that point on because he doubts. Okay, so that's that story. That's what he's doing. He's lighting the incense. Now the incense served these 2 purposes. One was that the incense represented the prayers of the people to God, the sweet aroma of the prayers that would go up to God. And so like in Psalm 141:2, David says this, "Accept my prayer as an incense offered to you." Prayers were a way to connect to the divine. It was the way, it was symbolic of their prayers that would go up to God. Now, why in front of the veil? So you have the altar, the veil, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant served as the footstool of God. It was the throne, but more the footstool, because God sits above the earth and he is over all things. And it's as if his feet come down, and that's where his feet reside, is on the Ark of the Covenant, which has a cover on the top called the mercy seat. We'll get into that in a second. But so they would go and light these incense, and the fragrant the incense would go up, and it would represent the prayers of the people. But it also served another very important purpose. In Exodus chapter 30, it outlines that this incense, this smoke, served as protection when you would approach the Lord. Protection. Because once a year, there was a thing that the Israelites did on what's called the Day of Atonement, where they would sacrifice a lamb. They would take the blood of that lamb. They would sprinkle it on the 4 corners of the altar of incense. Then it said that the priest would take some of the incense and put it in a container. Then the priest would put his arm inside on the other side of the veil, because it served as protection. Because to be in the presence of God and to have sin meant death. Like, this was a warning, so that he would have to put the incense inside the veil, and he would shake it, and then it would fill up with smoke, so that once a year the high priest could go inside the veil with the blood of the lamb and sprinkle it on the mercy seat. And by doing that, on the Day of Atonement, it represented the forgiveness of sins for the people. So the smoke fills the room so that they can enter in, lest they look at the ark or touch it and die, because the holiness and glory of the Lord was there. Like, to be a priest was dangerous work. It was dangerous work. So they had a veil to protect them from the glory of God that would lead to death if they touched it or gazed upon it. And they would put the smoke in from the altar of incense to cloud up the room so that they could walk in. This is outlined in Leviticus 16. You can read again about the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 17. But this was very important work. It was dangerous. It was dangerous. And so this is what the altar of incense did. Every day they would light incense. It would be the smoke, the prayers of the people. Once a year they would take that and they would put it in there in the Holy of Holies, so it would fill up with smoke, and they can perform the sacrifice of sprinkling the blood on the mercy seat for the forgiveness of sins. Exodus 30 also records for us how to make this incense. This incense was a very specific blend that you could only make for this purpose. So God outlines this says you can only make this blend with this, do this recipe this specific way. And do we have any people that are like follow the rules recipe people? Like, that's me. Like, if my wife and I, we watch cooking shows all the time. That's one of our favorite things to do, all different types of cooking shows. And it blows my mind how they can just grab things and they're just throwing, It's like, do you even measure? It like gives me anxiety. Like, how do you know how much to put in? It just blows my mind that people can do that. But there was a specific recipe you had to follow, which, if you're like me and you have to follow the recipe, you'd be good. You'd be good in this situation making this. But this recipe included a gum resin from a boswellia tree. And this tree is in the Arabian Peninsula, where you can find this tree. And it was this gum resin that you would collect from this tree that was a major component in the recipe to make this incense. Can I get any guesses on what that resin was called? Frankincense. Frankincense was part of the recipe to make this incense. Why do I tell you this? So why go into all of this detail about the tabernacle, the altar of incense, the smoke, and all of these things? And I believe to understand the significance of what Matthew's trying to tell us in Matthew chapter 2, we need to go back and understand the importance. Why does he tell us these ingredients? And if you're paying attention this week in home group and you go back and you read Exodus chapter 30, you're going to read that there are two other elements that are involved in making this altar of incense. Anybody guess what the other two elements are? Gold, myrrh. Gold was used to completely cover the altar of incense, and myrrh was the oil used to anoint it to make it holy. And frankincense was the incense used to burn. It's as if Matthew's telling us that the wise men knew something. It's as if he's cluing us in that there's something more going on with these gifts than just simply nice little presents that they got Jesus. It's as if they're making a proclamation. They're foreshadowing who this child will become. It's as if they're saying that he will become the altar of incense. The one who connects us to the divine through the prayer and protects us. He connects us, he protects us. Matthew, and here's the thing, like, maybe I'm making a leap here, right? Because you can't prove this, right? There's nowhere there's like this extra biblical source like that goes, this is what this is. Like, these are assumptions. I think they're pretty good assumptions. And here's why I think this. Here's why I think Matthew's telling us something very specific about who Jesus is going to be, or at least who the wise men thought he was going to be. It's because Matthew gives us other hints about this connection. You see, at the end of Jesus' life, Matthew tells us another story. He tells us in Matthew chapter 27, listen to this. Then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. This is at his death. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two. The very thing that separated the people from God, the altar of incense stood in front of, Matthew says, hey, look, when Jesus sacrificed, when he gave up his life, he says at that moment, the temple that was modeled after the tabernacle, that had a veil that separated them from the Holy of Holies, which represented the presence and place of God, was torn in two. Now, all of a sudden, there is nothing that separates us. This is why the writer of Hebrews can say this. And he says, so let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. The writer of Hebrews says, now we can come boldly to the mercy, to the place of God. Why? Because of the work of the altar of incense, because of the work of Jesus. Jesus is the altar of incense who, like a priest, takes our prayers to the Father and, like a king, protects us from death. We approach, this is why Jesus in the gospel, he says, no one can come to the Father but through me. Because he serves as the access to God. He is the altar of incense that we can approach God through the person of Jesus. He is our connecting point. And the beauty of the Christmas story through the lens of the wise men is that we can all now come before the Creator with confidence that it's going to be okay and hope that he hears our prayers. I think Matthew's tapping into something here. And these magi, we know they're people from the east. We know that they're Arabian is they're that area of the world that they come from. And we don't know what kind of people they are, but they were probably God followers, Yahweh worshipers. Right? They weren't from Jewish descent, but that doesn't mean that they weren't worshipers of God. And I think these gifts symbolize that they knew something about this child. And the beauty of all of this is that we now have access to God, to the divine. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Do you see how Jesus funnels it in to him? When we come to Jesus, he is the sweet aroma. He is the sweet aroma of presence and access to God. So what does this mean for us? There's a couple things I hope that we take away this Christmas season in light of these thoughts that I hope you explore through the week. Maybe I've just dropped a little seed that makes you go, well, what about this? And what about that? And all of a sudden, connections are being made in your heart, in your mind. But here's a couple things I want you to walk away with. Number one is the reality that Jesus is the priest king through which you see and experience the divine. You connect to the creator of all things through the person of Jesus. And so thus begs the question, are you coming to Jesus? Are you willing to surrender to Jesus? Because he is the one that connects us to it. And the second thing is this, the gift of frankincense reminds us that God hears our prayers and God's presence is accessible through Jesus. That's what the altar of incense was. God hears our prayers. God hears our prayers, the sweet aroma, and we can access the presence of God through the person of Jesus. We now have access to the ark, to the Holy of Holies, to the throne room of God through the person of Jesus. Now here's the challenge, and I love this verse, Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. John writes this about Jesus, speaking to him, "I stand at the door and knock. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in, and we will share a meal together as friends." Jesus stands at the door and knocks. Are you willing, like he initiated, more than just waiting for you to come to him, he said, all right, I'll take the first step. I'm going to rip that veil open. I'm going to be here. I'm ready. Are you going to come to Jesus? It's one thing to give a gift. It's another thing just to simply to come. And the challenge for us this morning is this Christmas season. Are we filling our lives and our space and our time with things that are good and fun? Sure. But are they Jesus? Are you coming to Jesus this season? And what does that look like for your family to begin that tradition, if you don't already? That you pause and you go, all right, we're going to come to Jesus. He's here, he's waiting, standing at the door, knocking, ready to bring us in. As we get ready for communion, our team that's going to have communion baskets, Yeah, we're going to make their way forward. So if you didn't grab the elements on your way in, just lift your hand. They'll make their way to the back, and they'll make sure to get you some communion. But I want you to wrestle with these questions. One, right, this idea of, do you believe that Jesus is your priest king? Do you trust him? Maybe you're here this morning and you have not put your trust in him. Maybe there are parts of your lives that you're holding back because you've been hurt, because you doubt, because you're afraid. What if? Can I just encourage you to put your trust in him this morning? And all it takes is because Jesus is standing there knocking. He's going, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Would you let me in? All it does is just say, Jesus, I'm ready to trust you. I'm ready to follow you. Would you wrestle with that reality? Or maybe the reality of like, you know what? I haven't been coming to Jesus. I've been fighting this on my own. I've been so consumed in this season that I haven't actually been coming to you, Jesus. And I'm ready to reorient my life around that reality. Let's wrestle with that for a few minutes before we take communion together.